Hello and welcome to episode 79, Podcasting as Positioning with Brandy Whalen, who is the co-founder of Kitcaster. Today we're going to talk about podcasting, how it goes with PR, how to get ready for a podcast, and a lot more.
Welcome to the PR Playbook Podcast, the only podcast giving you actionable skills and advice you need to execute a strategic PR program. Warning: what you hear next may lead to brand awareness and increased sales and customer exposure. Now here's your host, Rinjini Joshua.
Hi, Brandy. How are you doing?
Hi there. So good. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, no, I'm so happy to have you because I've got so many guests coming my way from Kitcaster actually. So it's been a pleasure to meet you now finally and talk a little bit about podcasting. First, just to get started, it would be great to just get a little bit about your background and Kitcaster, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I actually come from the world of public relations. I had a small boutique agency for about 6 years, specializing mostly in B2B, a lot in the tech space, some in the financial space, and always incorporating podcasts into the campaigns, and kept hearing feedback from my clients. They get done with the podcast and they were like, that was so fun. I had
Yeah.
a great time. I posted it on LinkedIn. So many people saw it. I got phone calls. So it was interesting. It was interesting feedback because I felt like it was something that they were gravitating towards more than any of the other media placements that we would land them.
Mhm.
And 2 years ago, decided to go all in on podcasts and really take the agency a completely different direction. Have a colleague that I had done. He was actually a podcast host here. We're in Denver, Colorado.
Okay.
He had a business podcast. I had a few of my clients on his podcast. And so we teamed up and started Kitcaster 2 years ago.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, no, I think that makes a lot of sense because when you're talking to someone on a podcast, you're able to, connect with them. It's your voice. It's almost kind of like the whole premise of Clubhouse, right? Like you're
Yeah.
talking without having to really look at people and be able to kind of shoot the shit about a conversation that feels good to you. And of course, you have to be able to choose the right podcast. So tell us a little bit about Kitcaster in particular and what you guys do.
So we help get founders and C-suite executives on top podcasts. So our goal is to get, because we feel the same way. I mean, it's really connecting, right? So you want that personal connection that people have with a brand. And what better way to do that than go on a 30-minute, 60-minute podcast, talk about where you've been, maybe some missteps you've had along the way. People love those stories. There's that connection that people have when you start to show your cards.
Uh-huh.
This is who I am, this is what I've done, these are the hurdles I've had to jump over, here's where I fell on my face, I pulled myself back up. Really going into the problems that they're solving from a unique perspective. So that's our goal. And when we bring on a client, we're looking at their expertise and what can you talk about for 60 minutes?
Mhm.
And usually coming up with four or five different things that they can discuss. A lot on leadership. I feel like everyone's always looking for new leadership strategies. So not only talking about what they're doing in their business, but how they're organizing their company.
Mm. And then how do you identify which podcasts are right for them? There's just a growing number of podcasts that are happening at this point and it's becoming such a big deal. I know during the pandemic there was a huge boom. How do you identify what the right podcast is for somebody?
Yeah, there are 2.6 million podcasts. So that is a huge challenge. We do a pretty extensive onboarding. We have, it's interesting because we systematized and created a slick process to get people onboarded and to start their campaign right away. So in the onboarding, we identify different categories that they could speak to. And we're really looking at those categories and using our internal resource to look at podcasts categorically, and then making sure that they are top top notch. So
Right.
we use another resource where we're looking at, are these podcasts within the 10%, 10% ranked global podcasts. So
Mhm.
that's just how we kind of vet from a surface level, and then digging in deeper to make sure that it is indeed a good fit and it would
Yeah.
be a good conversation.
Now I've been seeing a lot more of these. And I didn't, I used to get a lot of people just reaching out to me, offering their expertise. And now I'm seeing a lot more of these like one pagers and these bios and people talking about, I mean, it makes it so great for someone like me who's always looking for content. It makes it so easy to kind of identify what they're going to be talking about. But what can you tell us a little bit more about this kind of like one sheet process? What people should have on their little, it's not necessarily like a resume, but it's like an expert bio. How are people putting this together?
Yeah, and that's actually something we do in every campaign is put the media, we call them a media page, but yeah, it's a one sheet. One of the things that I think is really important, we like to give a snapshot of who it is that's going to be interviewed. And part of that is a bio, but really what they're bringing to the conversation.
Hmm.
Because I always tell our team is we're not selling a person to a podcast, we're selling a conversation
Right.
and and the content, right? Because that's what you want, is to have an engaging conversation for your listeners.
Mhm.
So making sure that one pager has, what are you going to talk about? What unique things can you share that maybe hasn't been shared before?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I usually see like a few topics. So how do you guys typically come up with those topics for the experts? What is your best advice on coming up with those topics? Because I know I've been in business for 10 years. I know, there's experts and executives who've been in business for 20, 30, 40 years. How do you boil that down to two or three topics?
Yeah, that's really hard. And some people are really clear on what it is that they can speak to, and others we have to really work on pulling them out. So we have the onboarding document that walks them through it, but even that can sometimes not lead them down the path enough.
Right.
So
Yeah.
then we do a conversation like this, and we just keep digging. Like,
Okay.
how do you manage? What are some key metrics that you use to manage success in your business? So just trying to continue to ask questions to get to those few things that you're like, oh wow, that's really cool.
Yeah.
That's interesting. We have over 130 clients, so
Wow.
we've heard a lot of different, kind of ways of managing a business and core expertise. So we can really kind of tune into things that are unique and different that could be used as those talking points.
What do you think are the best benefits that you've seen for clients that you've, had on being on podcasts? Because I think that's the other thing is like, is it valuable for me to be spending that 60 minutes or 30 minutes on a podcast?
Yeah, we see them really valuable piece of educational content. So if you have, especially if you have a complex product or service, being able to explain it on a podcast where you have somebody that probably depending on what podcast it is, we're likely going to be looking at something that they can speak the language.
Right.
So if
Right.
you're having a conversation with somebody that can speak your language and really dive into the goods of what you have, what we found with a lot of our clients is that the people who are interested in their service product, we do a lot with SaaS products.
Yeah.
Um, when they're able to explain that on a podcast, and then somebody who's interested in their SaaS product, when they come to them via phone call, email, they have a really good understanding of what they do and how they do it. And it
Right.
shortens that sales cycle to pretty much a phone call or an email, because they already, everything, all the legwork that you would have done to lead up to kind of lead that customer to water, it's already done. You just explained it all, and they
Yeah.
heard.
So I mean, basically you could use it as like content, lead gen. that kind of stuff that you might have on your website or of obviously LinkedIn and things like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's tons of ways to repurpose a podcast interview. I mean, just transcribing it into a blog post. You could send it to a prospective client if they,
Mhm.
this may answer some of the questions that you have. Also happy to jump on a call.
Yeah, we have a couple of podcasts. Well, I mean, this is like early on. I think it was like, how to pick a PR agency and like some of the basics. And you're like, well, you're not sure what to pick. We'll just shoot you the podcast and you could take a quick listen. And a lot of our podcasts are short, so that was a lot like easy as well. I mean, what is your advice on that? Do you have any thoughts on when you're choosing podcasts, the length of the podcast, the format of the podcast? Everyone has like such a different format. Does that really matter, or are you looking for quantity when you're going for it?
Yeah, I think quality versus quantity is always good. I think in the beginning, especially if you haven't done a podcast
Yeah.
before, warming up with three that might be kind of, I don't want to say lesser known podcasts, but maybe a little bit easier,
Right.
and then kind of working your way up is a strategy that we typically use depending on where people are. But yeah, I mean, I really, I think that the interview style is really important.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've been on other podcasts, but
Yeah, of course, of course.
yeah, and it varies greatly.
Oh
And
yeah, and then you could tell like also I've noticed like you could tell when you're interviewing somebody else who's also been podcasting because they know how to keep the conversation going and the
yes,
conversation's a little bit more dynamic. They know that little sound bites are, very important. So, do you guys, when you prepare your guests or your executives, do you provide them sound bites and messages that they should be covering, while they're going through the process?
yeah, we do. We do media training with our clients and really try to dive in deep to what's your hook? What are your
Yeah.
stories? How are you going to weave? What's kind of that common thread that we're going to weave throughout the whole conversation? And
Mhm.
also how people consume podcasts. I
Right.
mean, we all have very short attention spans. So, somebody could tune in for 5 minutes, somebody could tune in for 30 minutes,
Yeah.
just making sure that you're kind of meeting people throughout the whole interview, and
Right.
maybe coming in midpoint, coming back to that big like hook and pull in that you gave in the beginning of
Yeah.
the conversation, and bringing it back again, but just in a different, unique way.
Yeah. I mean, I've even noticed, like, I think that's important to understand too, is like put yourself in the position of the listener, right? So I listen to really long podcasts if I'm running. If I'm driving in the car going somewhere, I'll listen to something that's like, based on my map of
Yeah.
how long I'm going to be in the car. So I think that's really important too. People listen to it while they're walking outside, exercising, doing a number of things. So I feel like that's another interesting way to kind of prepare for a podcast is to be, putting yourself in the position of the listener, right?
Yeah, you think about it, the type of medium that podcasts are, you are usually multitasking.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Typically, right? I mean, when you're reading a news article, you're not multitasking, you're
No.
reading. You'd be super talented. I would love to meet a person that could be reading a news article and doing something else. But so by nature, people are using it as a way to distract you from a monotonous task.
Right, right.
Commuting, running, doing the dishes, doing
Right.
laundry. So you need to think about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love it. I think that's such a great model, actually, and such a really specific niche. I think it's important because we've also, throughout the pandemic, we've talked a lot about thought leadership and expertise and how that's kind of like a flagship to a lot of PR content that is being created now. We do full PR programs, but I think in this part that you guys address in this expert thought leadership part, you mentioned some other pieces of content that you can make. Can you kind of dive a little bit deeper in the different types of content that typically comes out from when you have someone doing an interview on a podcast?
Yeah, so we actually do some content repurposing. We have a product called the Content Studio. And so what we're doing is we're taking the audio interview and then we're going to make 8 to 10 social media posts.
Oh, wow.
Because you just did like a 30, 60-minute interview, you
Yeah.
better believe that there's some fantastic quotes in there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
pulling those quotes out, creating audiograms, which are pictures with audio. I'm sure that many people know what that is, but some don't.
Yeah.
And then we do a short blog and a long blog for folks as well. So that's kind of what we typically do with our content studio. And, we've had clients that have turned them into white papers.
Yeah. That's smart. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I guess it depends on the nature of the actual podcast. If it is more technical versus more entertainment versus, yeah. I mean, we have some, like you said, if you're dealing with a SaaS client and they're B2B, then that can easily be translated to a white paper. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you think about some of the very tech focused like AI podcasts that
Yes.
typically the hosts are so knowledgeable and ask smart questions, and like what a great way to turn that into a full ebook or a bigger content piece.
Yeah. No,
So
that's so great. I think being able to multi-purpose content like that is really important. So what would you think, what would you say are some kind of, if you're new to podcasting, you really want to get involved, I'm going to ask you a couple of different things. One, what is like the best way to identify some low hanging fruit, or like, podcasts that might say yes?
yeah, yeah. I typically would recommend people check out iTunes,
Okay.
find podcasts that you listen to, whether that's in your field of work or maybe entertainment, just depending on what it is that you're wanting to be a guest on. And then look at, so you click on the actual podcast that you enjoy, and then look at the like podcast. So when you scroll down and you're
Oh,
looking
the
at
similar
other,
podcasts.
yeah, the similar podcasts, and then really start to kind of look at those, and you could dig in maybe
Oh, yeah.
like 3 layers down,
Yeah.
starting there, knowing that, hey, someday maybe I want to be on this podcast, but
Yeah.
understanding that I need to work my way up to that. So
Right.
going to the similar podcasts and digging through and seeing, first of all, a podcast that has guests on all the time. They will most likely be looking for guests, and
Yeah.
then looking at the pedigree of guests that they have, and kind of seeing if that matches you. And I think that's the best place to start.
Yeah, no, that's a very good tip. Okay, so then now I've got a list of podcasts. You walk me through this list. I'm ready to go. I want to pitch myself. What is like the best way to pitch myself, present myself? And you kind of covered this a little bit, but just a little bit more direct. How should I pitch myself? Let's say I have podcast A, and I really want to put myself on podcast A.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different ways, especially if you're new to pitching podcasts. One of the things that I always say is nice is to ask,
Yeah.
"Hey, are you looking for guests?"
Wow, what a concept.
What a concept, right? And if so, what kind of guests are you looking for?
Yeah.
And just open up the conversation, and they'll typically tell you if you ask. And then, if it's something that you can fit into the conversation, then that's perfect. That's an open door to then follow up with, great. No, I would love to
I
come
can
on your
talk about,
show.
yeah.
Yeah, and talk about 3 things. Name 3 things that would be interesting to that specific podcast and their audience,
Yeah.
and make it about their audience and
Yeah,
their
that's
podcast.
we've had these conversations. My team, we've been talking about influencers a lot, and obviously for social media purposes, and a lot of people have become disheartened with Instagram influencers and other kinds of influencers, because when you're looking at them, you're actually reaching their audience. You're meeting their purpose, and you don't always get to digest and give them your purpose and your message. So it's you're catering to somebody else's audience. The best synergy is when both of your audiences are the same, ideally.
Yeah.
So,
Yes. Yes.
so I think that's also important to realize, is like, if is that podcast audience also your audience? Are you speaking the right language to them? So I think those key talking points are really important. Okay,
Yeah.
so now you've kind of uncovered, I found my podcast A. These are my talking points. Now I'm booked. I'm booked on the podcast. I'm excited to go. Some things that I may not know that I should get ready for. How should I prepare?
Well, I would recommend listening to the podcast in advance. So you'd be surprised. I know that that's like people find that so funny, but I also am like, you'd be surprised how many people do not listen to
Yeah.
the podcast before they. I'm sure you've experienced that a few
Yeah,
times.
absolutely. Absolutely. They get so excited about being in the podcast that they forget about actually listening. Yes.
Yeah, and just, spot check a few episodes because there usually is a question that might throw you off guard. It could be, who's the most influential person that you've ever met?
Mhm.
What's your favorite book? You just don't want to be caught off guard and you want to have a thoughtful answer. So making sure that you listen to the previous episodes is valuable. Also having your hook. What is your hook? How are you going to come out of the gate? I think most podcasts start with, hey, so glad to have you
Yep.
on the show. Tell me a little bit about yourself. We'll come out of the gate very strong.
Uh-huh.
And instead of talking about your product or service, maybe talk about the problem that you're solving with
Yeah.
your product and service. Like, hey, we saw that this was people were wanting to be on more podcasts, but they weren't really sure how to do that. So we started this company. And that way you're able to kind of to talk to people in a way that they're able to understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It's
making sure,
tangible.
yeah, yeah. I think we kind of just dive into what we know and what we do and forget that we have to bring people up to that point.
Yeah.
Otherwise they're lost from the beginning.
Absolutely. Have you that's these are great tips. Do you have any others that we need to add to this little queue? So
Yeah.
the first thing you said was first listen to some previous podcasts, know what your hook is what you're going to be focused on and coming out of the gate with. And what was the next one?
Yeah, I would also say some stories, some really powerful stories, some anecdotes. If
Yeah.
if you have them, talk about maybe a client that used your service or product. They were struggling with this, and after we worked with them, they experienced this. Also, startling stats. Everyone loves statistics. If you can,
Do
if
you
you
have any
can.
startling statistics for us? You did mention the 2.6 million podcasts.
Yes, which is startling.
That is very startling. The very startling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to think if I have other ones for you. You know what? Next time I'm
Yeah.
going to come back on
Okay.
and I'll have like 10.
Perfect. So I do have a question about an anecdote. So have you ever just had a podcast go just wrong, just so wrong? And what do you do when that happens?
We actually haven't,
Awesome.
shockingly. I don't know how. I've been waiting. We certainly have had podcasts that maybe didn't go quite as planned. And for us, like we deliver 10 podcast interviews in 3 months.
Oh, wow.
That's what we do. And part of what we guarantee is that you're going to have a good time.
Yeah.
Satisfaction and guarantee is that we want you to feel good about it. And
Right.
if you don't feel good about it, you need to tell us and we're going to make it right. And
Yeah.
if that means that we add another one to your campaign, that's what we do.
Uh-huh.
So we've had a few of those and mostly just like I didn't jive with the host
Right.
or, I felt like their questions just were not thoughtful, they weren't prepared, things like that. But we haven't had anything go terribly wrong.
Yeah. I
Thank
remember
goodness.
I've only had a couple of podcasts where I like, I cannot publish this. They're like, it's just so bad. I mean, other than audio problems, which I've had when interviewing people outside of the country, I've interviewed
Sure.
media outlets. I mean, that's another huge thing, right? Sound quality. So I've had a couple of problems there where we had to scrap it or re-record. But there's only been, I mean, I think we're at episode like 80 or something now, and there's only been like two or three where I'm like, wow, we just really can't publish this podcast. It's just so bad. Conversation's so bad. And I agree. I don't think it's anyone's fault at that point. You have to have a little bit of humor and humility in doing this kind of interview process, because it's, you might not get along with the guest, or you might not get along with the host, or maybe you're just having a bad day. I don't know. There's so
Yeah.
many things. But that's true.
There are. Yeah. And I think we certainly have had that.
Yeah.
We've had just episodes that haven't been published for
Yeah.
whatever reason. And it usually, I mean, it's shocking. They both know. I mean, the
Yeah.
host and the guest know. It's like one of those things, it's like, yeah, that
That
wasn't
was
good.
terrible. Let's just go.
Yeah,
Let's just
we're
call it.
not even going to ask any questions. We
Yeah.
both know what happened there, and so we haven't had to have any really bad conversations. It's interesting because like usually it's our client that's like, hey, that didn't go very well, and I
Yeah.
don't think it's going to publish. And it's like, thank you for letting us know. We'll
Yeah.
we'll
We'll
make that
follow
right.
up and we'll see what they say. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
No.
So yeah, it's interesting because it is, as you know, even just working with your clients,
Yeah.
it's a 60-minute conversation and
Yeah.
things can go terribly wrong.
It's a bit nerve wracking, especially if you haven't really done good research. I mean, I think that's the value in something like Kitcaster, where you can identify what the right targets are. You do not want to go after the wrong podcast that will ask you the wrong questions or puts you in a situation that you just are going to be uncomfortable. And then you know that saying, people say that all press is good press. I mean, only PR people would not agree with that.
Truly, I know, right? And there are some podcast hosts that will really tear into you, and that's just what they do. And we've worked with some, but we are always upfront with our client, like, hey, this is going to be a really challenging interview, and they're typically excited for it. But yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, no, all media is not good.
Not good. Well, that actually brings me to probably one of my last questions for you is, have you noticed, and I sometimes do this and I sometimes don't. So I'd love to get your perspective since you work with so many podcasts, and for people to have some kind of understanding of what they might be getting into when doing it. Do you always get questions in advance? And when people are preparing, can they ask those questions? Like, can I get questions in advance? Or, do they kind of have to just wing it?
It's all over the map.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are questions in advance, and the podcast host will follow those questions throughout the entire interview. And sometimes you just get a kind of a vague direction of where they want to take the interview, some of the things that they think are interesting to discuss. And sometimes you get nothing.
Yeah.
And so all of the above. And I personally, I don't know how you feel, but I love this. Like, I love just having a conversation and not necessarily preparing
Too many
with
rigid
questions.
answers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because
Yeah.
nice, but I think that's also like an interview style, right? Like, you have to be able to be comfortable with kind of picking up on what's being said and asking questions off the cuff. I know I actually host another podcast, and I always they're pretty high profile people that we interview in the cannabis industry, and so we pretty much have to send them questions in advance. But I tell them straight up at the very beginning, I'm like, look, we have these questions, but I never ask all of the questions because my mind just goes in another direction and the conversation
Yeah.
goes in another direction. So you want it to be a fun conversation and people to learn from it. And that's, for this podcast, especially, we like people to have tips and tricks to walk away with. So yeah, I do like the conversational style. So given that we like to have tips and tricks, any like, major tips and tricks that you think people should follow when they're diving into podcasting for the first time?
Yeah. Well, you brought up a really good point, is your equipment. And you don't have to spend a lot, but I highly recommend a mic outside of your computer device and a set of headphones and kind of I guess, somewhat of a soundproofing room
Yeah.
of sorts, or at least, minimize the echoing and distractions and noises. But that is That's huge because the sound quality, people are either going to tune in or tune out based on that.
Totally.
Also knowing that the podcasts are evergreen. This is
Yeah.
content that's going to live there forever. And knowing that when you're on an interview, when you're talking in time, make sure that you have a point of reference.
Right. Yeah, that's really great. That's such a good point. Yeah. I don't,
Yeah.
sometimes we talk about time, sometimes you don't. I guess it depends on the topic too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's okay. Like you can
Yeah.
say, hey, in 2 weeks, we're launching this new product line.
Yeah.
But like then say, I know some of you are going to be tuning in at a later date. So this
Right.
is,
Well,
it's
that's funny because when the pandemic first started, it was should I mention that we're in a pandemic? Should I not mention we're in a pandemic? And it's gone on long enough where you can't not say it, but
yeah.
it's just so interesting to understand the value of time and space, when you're talking to someone.
Absolutely. Yeah. And podcasts are you know how it goes. If you find a podcast and you just dive into it, you can binge a whole season
Yes.
or 20 episodes and they could have been published 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's, I think that they're timeless and making sure that you address that when
Yeah.
you're being interviewed. Yeah. I think the
And
last tip
yeah.
is a good call to action.
What is your
Because
call to action, Brandy?
my call to action is connect with me directly.
Yes.
I give my email address. I'm always open to conversation. I'm always open to just answer any question that you have.
Perfect. Oh, actually, that's what I was going to ask you. I was going to say, so how can people find you specifically, and what is the best way to contact you?
Yeah, so you just reach out to me via email. My email is Brandy, Brandy, at Kitcaster, Kitcaster. And would love to just chat with anyone. If you have any questions about podcasts, how to be the best guest on a podcast, anything, I'm happy to jump on a call.
Awesome. And one last question. Do you have a favorite podcast that you listen to that people should check out?
Like, I don't even get to listen to podcasts for enjoyment anymore. I mean, it's enjoyment. It's a
Yeah,
different kind
yeah,
of enjoyment.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I listen to the daily
Okay. Okay.
most days.
Yeah.
So
Guilty pleasure that you just kind of get up to speed on what's going on. That's
yeah, I think it's necessary just kind
yeah.
of like keep me in the know of what's happening. I don't really consume news.
Yeah.
Um, I read a tiny bit, but I tune into the daily most
Yeah.
days.
Okay.
Yeah. How
I'm
about
gonna, I'm
you?
gonna check
What's your
it out
favorite?
just on your recommendation. Mine, I've been trying to be more exploratory, and I'm
Yeah,
training for a marathon, so I've got a lot of time on my with my ears, and I love the 10% Happier podcast, so I listen to that
a
a
great
lot,
one.
especially because of craziness, madness that we're all living in. And then I really like, I mean, I've been listening to a lot of stuff with special guests. So I actually look at podcasts based on the guests sometimes. So I'll
Yep.
look up the guest and then just see the show. So that's something that people considers too. Like, maybe the people are not looking up that particular show, but they might be looking you up as a guest. And so I think it works
Yeah,
both ways, right? Like it's reverse PR for both the podcast and the podcast guest.
absolutely. Yeah. And if there's someone that you aspire to be, or you feel like, I want to be like Simon Sinek, I
Yeah.
feel like I'm on the same path. Look at all the podcasts that he's been on. Look at the
Yes.
journey. I've done that for a few clients where we've
Yeah.
kind of started, you're like, wow, they started off here and they've built themselves up to,
Yeah.
being interviewed by Brene Brown. I mean,
Yeah.
it's starting from like a little industry podcast. So that's also a really great way to kind of figure out what your podcast journey is going to look like.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We do that a lot of it's like competitive coverage, right? You're looking at your competitors to kind of see or people that are not competing, okay? Maybe they're your like-minded people that are doing the same thing or something similar or people you look up to. I think that's a great way to find a good podcast to be on featured on. So thank you. Those are great tips.
Yeah.
We will put all of your contact information, of course, into the show notes. So everybody look at that. And then, of course, we'll put your website in there as well. Thank you so much for your time today. This is quick and wonderful and easy to digest. So hopefully people got some good tips.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also work with PR agencies. So if you don't want to dive into the world of
The podcasting
podcasting,
world, it's like a whole different planet. It's like social media, right? It's like
it is. It totally is. So we're happy to jump in and just be the podcast arm, just
awesome.
operating silently in the back.
That's fantastic. Good to know.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Brandy. And we'll talk to you next time.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you so much.